And this is coming more from, a critic or an ex-member who doesn't believe in the Book of Mormon's historicity. So they might say, forget about all the convergences you talk about in your book. Forget about the last episode. Forget about chiasmus or the complexity or the witnesses. Why doesn't, King James Bible passages, errors, anachronisms, the revivalist language, Protestant sermons, similarities between Lehi's dream and his own father's dream, maybe the view of the Hebrews and like the mound builder myth about the Native Americans coming from the lost 10 tribes and that being similar to, the Nephites and the Lamanites coming from Israel, and Joseph's own sort of creative genius in his vocabulary. Why doesn't that just explain the Book of Mormon with, his creative genius? Like, why not go with that naturalistic explanation? And you're just making excuses with your conceptual translation to account for all the problems.
Yeah. If you're looking at parallels and you're saying, I'm just looking at this set of things, yeah, you can come up with a naturalistic explanation of the Book of Mormon that says, yeah, why couldn't he do this? Why couldn't he be a creative genius? Well, he could have. And if he were, the longer that text was extant, the longer we dealt with it, the more we tried to find history in it, the worse it would get.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I'm really excited for today's episode. This is going to be part 3, where I have back with me scholar Brant Gardner. Brant, thanks for joining me again.
It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, beautiful shirt you have on. Nice sort of pinky color.
Thank you much.
And so in the previous episodes, we talked about sort of like Book of Mormon historicity and the connections between the text of the Book of Mormon to Mesoamerican geography, Mayan culture, history, culture. And we went through that. We also looked at some of the criticisms against the Mesoamerican geographical model, and Brant gave his response to that. And we also touched on his view and sort of critique of the Heartland geographical model as well. So that's in the previous episodes. So go back and watch that one. In today's episode, we're going to be focusing mostly on his view of the translation of the Book of Mormon. If it is historical, if it is an ancient text, then what is the nature of the translation? We're going to be talking a lot about also Joe Smith's involvement in sort of folk magic, using a seer stone, treasure digging as well. And a lot of what we're going to discuss is in this book, but The Gift and Power, Translating the Book of Mormon, which is a really good book. So I'm going to promote that as well. But I encourage people to buy the book to go a little bit more in depth. So that's what we're going to do today. How does that sound, Brant?
That sounds good. If you get about 3 people to buy it, I can, buy a candy bar.
Super. Hopefully a big candy bar.
Yeah.
Decent sized one. And so in the last episode, there was one sort of pushback that I forgot to ask you about that people would raise against the Mesoamerican geographical model. So we'll talk about that briefly. Is Zelph the white Lamanite, which I believe comes when Joseph Smith and some of the church leaders are sort of marching in Zion's camp. And he points, I think he writes in a letter how they crossed like the plains of the Nephites to his wife Emma. And then there's some sources or accounts of there being like a skeleton. And he says that's Zelph the white Lamanite. I know Heartlanders would use that to support, the Book of Mormon happened here in North America. What's your take on that, on Zelph the white Lamanite?
I think, first of all, it's important to note that it's a Lamanite and not a Nephite. The second thing is they talk about going over the plains of, what is it? The plains of the Lamanites, the plain. Anyway,
I think it was the plains of the Nephites, if I'm remembering right, but aye.
Yeah. But they're not mentioned in the Book of Mormon. So this is not a Book of Mormon geographic location. This is some location somewhere, but it isn't mentioned in the Book of Mormon. We know that some of the peoples came north. There is no reason to believe that we don't have Lamanites moving north after the end of the Book of Mormon. So
but like Hagoth,
a Lamanite,
Hagoth, and some of these people went northward.
Yeah, I mean, having Lamanites that are northward is not unusual. So having him there The only thing you have to worry about is this idea of being a white Lamanite, and what does that mean? And the definition that you would get from the Book of Mormon would have been that he was a converted Lamanite. Yeah, and that must mean that somewhere, as Mormon is, or Moroni is doing his travels, he managed to talk to some people and convert a few people, perhaps some who kept that tradition going. So we don't know how long after the Book of Mormon closed that would have been there. If we actually had that skeleton and we dug it up archaeologically, we would find that it came from a time period long after the Book of Mormon.
Okay, so you wouldn't see that as necessarily undermining the Mesoamerican geographical model. And do you also think that this was Joseph Smith maybe guessing? Because we don't believe that he knew where the Book of Mormon took place. He probably
we don't.
Hemispheric geography. Do you think he was sort of guessing or speculating?
That incident for some people is taken as revelation, and some people it's just a discussion or speculation. However you want to read that, I would say that most of the scholars would not accept it as a revelation. But even in the heartland, for the people who would say yes, this was a revelation, it would be a revelation that's so late that it wouldn't have anything to do with the Book of Mormon or Book of Mormon geography. It would simply say, this is, something that occurred after the Book of Mormon ended. Mark Wright gave a paper at Fair several years ago called Heartland is Hinterland.
Yes,
and basically he gave the example. He argued that after the Book of Mormon, there would have been a northern migration. We know that there was a northern migration of peoples from Mesoamerica up into at least the southeast. So the fact that there is a Lamanite that might have known something, or might have either retained something because of heritage of a Nephite, because they didn't all die. The nation was gone, but not every single Nephite was dead, or somebody that Moroni had converted, but still after the Book of Mormon.
Right. Okay. So you're saying it's possible that Joseph Smith could have been not wrong then in saying that that's Zelph. Sure. It could have been something that maybe came from the Book of Mormon.
I mean, for those people who want to believe that was a revelation and that's exactly what happened, there is a context in which we can see that happening.
Okay. Super. So talking about the Book of Mormon translation, I grew up believing that Joseph Smith translated it, by the gift and power of God. Most of the depictions show him, with the plates, looking at the gold plates. We read about in his, official history as he describes it, using the Urim and Thummim, which are the Nephite interpreters of the spectacles. They're like two sort of like white-ish stones, weren't they? In a silver bow.
Multiple descriptions of them.
Yeah.
There's lots of different descriptions.
And they're kind of worn as spectacles. But actually, there's quite a few statements from some eyewitnesses like Emma Smith, his wife, Martin Harris, David Whitmer, maybe some others as well, who talk about him having a seer stone and him putting it into his hat, burying his face in the hat, and then either reading, and we'll get into that later with your view, or dictating the words as they appeared on the stone. And for a lot of people, I didn't know about that until I think after my mission, the seer stone was used. I remember somebody said to me that the church announced the seer stone, because I went on my mission 2015. I think that was the year the church sort of like publicly, released it, and there was I think an article, Joseph the Seer, about it. So I think it could be good to initially talk about seer stones and Joseph Smith's sort of folk magic, the culture in the 18th, 19th century of using not just seer stones, but things like divining rods, and people believing in buried treasure underground guarded by spirits. That was sort of like the culture that the environment that he was in. Is there anything you maybe want to tell us a bit about sort of like the 19th century magical folklore and culture he grew up in?
I think it's important to know that existed, because it gives a context to what Joseph was doing. because when we hear it, it's the reaction everybody has to the seer stone, which is, oh no, this is weird, this is strange. And
Hmm.
what we don't understand, because we come from a very different worldview, is for the people who lived in that worldview and at that time, this was perfectly normal. This was accepted. This is what you do. And if you dig into the history of this, it actually has a very long history, and it goes back into England and Ireland. Well, does it get to Ireland? I'm not sure.
I
I
don't
don't
know.
have evidence for it. Scotland, I do. Okay.
Okay.
So we know for sure that we get to Scotland and England with these concepts. And so these are things that had been part of folk culture in England, in the United Kingdom, that when people came from there and migrated to the colonies and then later the United States, as they moved into those new territories, they brought these ideas with them. Now,
Right.
these were ideas that were sort of in flux. They were prevalent at sort of the pre-modern times, and particularly in places where you didn't have as many educated people. You go to smaller villages, and how do you get a doctor if there is no doctor? And frankly, in many cases, they called them wise men or wise women. They were the ones that were frankly herbalists and probably better doctors than the doctors. There was one um, statement that I know is in the book somewhere, and I can't remember who said it, but basically he said, if you're sick, do anything but go to a doctor. Basically the doctor's going to kill you. Early doctors were not all that good, but these herbalists knew what they were doing. And so there was a great tradition of respect for the wise men and the wise women, and then other concepts that went along with that. And one of them was this thing that's sometimes called the second sight, but it's the ability to see something with the seer stone that otherwise you couldn't see. And there's multiple stories of them. um, John Dee, I think, was a counselor to Queen Elizabeth, and he had a seer stone that he
Mm.
consulted. So there's a long history of doing this. When we get to Joseph Smith, if you understand that history, it just isn't that unusual. What's unusual is that we're in flux in cultural change, where things are shifting away from these old folk magic, folk culture, folk understandings to a more scientific understanding. And there's conflict between the two. So there's the old tradition, there's this new thing coming in. And of course, the newfangled stuff is becoming dominant. And that becomes part of the story after the translation of the Book of Mormon. It isn't really part of the story until then. Up until the translation of the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith is part of this culture of people who believe that you can find things with the seer stone. And before the translation of the Book of Mormon, there are records of Joseph Smith using a seer stone to find lost things. He
Yeah.
found a lost wallet. He told somebody where their lost horse was. Um, Famously, Martin Harris was testing Joseph, and he said, I just dropped a pin. Can you find it in the tall grass? And
Right.
Joseph takes out a seer stone and is able to find it. Um,
He describes Josiah
but
Stowell's property as well, and Josiah Stowell's
yeah,
convinced of his seer gift and hires him to come to Harmony, Pennsylvania to help dig on the silver mine they were going to.
yeah, and all of that says, this is a context where Martin Harris believed that this was possible. Other people believed it was possible. So it's not strange at all. What I think is fascinating is, if somebody comes to me and, an angel Moroni came to me and said, by the way, you're going to translate something, my first response is, okay, where are the dictionaries? Give me the dictionary, give me where is the apparatus? Where's the grammar? Where's the dictionary? How am I going to do this? Moroni comes to Joseph, and Joseph's got the same question. How in the world am I going to do this? And so one of the questions that gets asked is, okay, maybe we'll find someone to translate it. And so they actually, with that in mind, we've got the plates, we're going to get them translated. Um, they said Martin Harris goes east to consult with the scholars to see if he can get someone to translate.
Yeah, he
So
takes some
the
of the
whole
characters with him.
Yeah, and the whole thing with Charles Anthon is because they're looking for someone to translate, and Anthon says, "Yeah, I can't do it. You know, like they look good, but yeah, I can't do it." So everything comes back, and it gets to Joseph, and Joseph realizes, "Okay, I'm going to have to do it." How is he going to do that? He looks at the plates and everything else, and he goes, how in the world am I going to see something that I can't see? How do I get the hidden message from this? And his only concept is to go back to what he knew, which is, I can find things with the seer stone. I can see things that otherwise could not be seen. And so it's absolutely logical in his world that he's going to use that seer stone as a means of translation because he's got nothing else. There's no
Right.
grammars. There's no nothing. Even if there were a grammar, Joseph wouldn't probably know how to read the darn thing. So yeah,
And
very
getting back
logical that he's
to
going to use the seer stone.
like the magical culture and is described as folk magic. Some people, particularly some Christians, might criticize that is this dark magic, black magic,
Yeah.
satanic stuff they were engaged with. My understanding is it was deemed as folk magic because it's the magic of the people, engaging in using seer stones or divining rods, and it was more their magical worldview and sort of like a pseudo scholarship, their understanding of how the world worked.
Yeah. It is unfortunate that it got labeled as magic because then you can say, okay, wait a minute, magic is not right. And then you get this occult thing. When I was talking about that clash between the old traditional and this newer modern science coming in, the idea that the that old folk belief was satanic is actually much later in history. It's a reaction to that.
Right.
It's a denial. It's sort of saying, okay, yeah, that's a bad thing. Well, it wasn't at the time.
Yeah.
It's a different reaction that people have when you get that label, and it's unfortunate.
So
What
almost kind of like
really
presentism, isn't
happens?
it? Because even whenever I
Oh
talked
yeah,
to Dan Vogel about it, he said that the Smiths and other people that would have engaged in these folk magic practices, they wouldn't have seen it as anything satanic or dark.
no,
They just would have understood that's how the world works and they're invisible
yeah.
forces,
I
and
mean,
it wouldn't have conflicted with Christianity, believing God or angels.
oh yeah, it did. Actually, it didn't conflict at all. For the
Mhm.
people who did it, it did not conflict. They intermixed their Christian religion with these, and frankly, the best as an anthropologist, I would call it a religion more than magic, because a religion is how do you find the way the world works, and this is part of how they defined the way the world works. And if you think about it, Christianity says that you have angels and people from God who can come and aid people on earth. And that's what they're saying happens is that, God can aid people on earth and can, help these things happen. So it's part of religion for them. And they didn't make any clear distinctions, but they had no problem, using seer stones on Thursday and going to church on Sunday. It was
Right.
perfectly normal.
Hmm.
And again, going back to their heritage from England, it was perfectly normal there as well. So yeah, the whole idea that it's satanic, that is actually a reaction that comes much later in time.
Right. And I read about it in your book, and I find this actually kind of interesting that there's maybe some sparse evidence that perhaps Joseph Smith Sr., so Joseph's father, might have used a divining rod. There's even some accounts in there of, I think, some of the neighbors, maybe one of his family members, can't remember, reporting that Joseph Smith actually used a divining rod as well in his youth, typically used to find water, but also maybe, lost objects, buried treasure. And Joseph Smith also, he had in his possession two seer stones. One, I believe, he obtained maybe around 1819, 1820 from Lake Erie. I think it was the White Stone. And then in 1822 from Willard Chase's property, I think when they were digging a well. And that's the sort of brown stone, the one that he used in dictating the Book of Mormon. And Joseph claimed that he had this ability to see in the stone and he was a seer. But that's actually not something that was unique to Joseph. There are other people like Sally Chase who also claimed to be seers in his
Yeah, and that was in
environment.
Palmyra. I mean, that's in Palmyra. That's in close proximity. When you spread the cast the net wider, there are a lot more people who were seers in a lot of other places. It's just fascinating to know that Joseph Smith wasn't the only one right where he lived. Other people did.
Yeah.
So again, that just reinforces the fact that this is natural and normal for them.
And this is part of the culture, and as you stated before, there are people who sincerely believed he had this gift. Like his mother Lucy said he could see things, not visible or natural to the naked eye. His father, I believe, whenever he was taken to court, the hearing, in 1826, his father talked about how he was sort of like embarrassed or like mortified that his son was using his seeric gift on, looking for buried treasure. I think he says filthy lucre. And he hopes that he would use it for like more righteous purposes. So a lot of people did believe that Joseph Smith had this gift as a seer to find lost property objects, and he was also hired, as a treasure seer as well. Could you maybe touch a wee bit on that, because that's something that concerns some people, is Joseph Smith's involvement in treasure digging or being hired as a treasure seer, but no treasure ever being found according to what we know.
There was a mania at the time for treasure digging, and as with many things that are related or similar to that, it's part of circumstances which were that it was really hard to live then, and people were poor, and people were hoping to find some way to survive. And so difficult circumstances sort of generated different responses. And in that region, somehow it got started that people could dig. Well, there were legends of buried treasure. Let's start there.
Right.
So legends of buried
Guarded by
treasure, and of course,
spirits.
yeah, if there's buried treasure and I'm poor, I would really like to dig up a buried treasure. It would really be good because, again, I'm poor and my neighbors are poor. And so people were digging all over the place. And it wasn't just Joseph, it was a lot of people who were digging. And because they were all participating in this older culture that had other ideas mixed in with it, you will get treasure guardians and you'll get all kinds of mythological things. The ones that get imputed to Joseph Smith are all after the fact, and they're affidavits of people that were collected by somebody who was antithetical to Joseph. And it seems quite likely that one of the reasons that people know that Joseph did all these things is because they were there with him doing the same thing and they believed the same thing.
Right.
Because by the time they get asked the question, Joseph is the culprit and they're okay and they're good.
Right.
But it's because of that, again, that conflict of, what do you believe and what don't you? But the important thing is to realize that this was happening all over. It wasn't a surprise. And because Joseph could see things that, that were buried or hidden, it would not be surprising that people wanted him to help. And in fact, Josiah Stowel hired him. And that's where we have, this very famous connection with him that, it gets him down to find Emma.
Yeah. Because I didn't realize this until I started studying church history, that Isaac Hale was part of the team of treasure digging, and they boarded with the Hales when he was hired by Josiah Stowel to work on the silver mine.
And so it's also famous that there was an 1823 trial where Joseph was put on trial for being
disorderly person, wasn't it?
What was it?
Disorderly person, like pretending to
disorderly person. Yeah. Basically, the idea would have been fraud in modern cases. That Joseph said that he could see, and he couldn't, and it was something that wasn't brought by Josiah Stowel, but by one of Josiah Stowell's relatives. Kind of forced this. And so Josiah Stowel is the guy who hired Joseph, and he stood up and he said, no, I believe Joseph could see it. We didn't find anything, but that, I don't believe that Joseph was defrauding me because I actually believe it and I have no qualms with him. What's really interesting about all of that is there's a part of the story where some of the the police come to Joseph and they're saying, look, we need to check to see if you really can do this. And so Joseph has a book, and he turns his back and he opens, has them open to a page, and he reads what's on the page. And then the constables that are there are saying, well, that's just a trick. So all of a sudden, Joseph is proving to these people that he can do it, but they don't believe the story. So right in that story of Joseph being a charlatan, we have this little small snippet that says, no, actually, he could do it. They didn't believe it, but the story is there, and somehow he was correct. Maybe he read an entire book and somehow knew which page.
Had it memorized, right?
Yeah.
So there's some people that really did.
However, you want to see the excuse, the story is that it actually worked, and so there are other stories like that where things worked. But with anything that you have in this folk magic world, sometimes things work and sometimes they don't. And it's never 100%. So
right.
Back in my early days in anthropology, we were studying magic, and they said, here's the thing about, the difference between magic and science. He said, science sometimes will be wrong. He said, magic is never wrong. Magic always works, always, 100% of the time. And if it doesn't, it's because somebody else's magic has counteracted yours.
Oh, okay. And sometimes there would have been those, excuses. There's some quotes from people. I think, is it Benjamin Franklin talked about as people were going out to try to find the buried treasure, that if they couldn't get it, they might say, oh, the enchantment was too strong, or, they did something wrong. So like the magical ritual. So like the magic of the guardian spirit was stronger than their magic.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I said the definition was. Magic always works. It's either your magic or somebody else's. And if there's another magic force working that's stronger than yours, it isn't going to work today.
I suppose when you think about treasure digging, I was just going to say, you talk about like it's people who are poor, who believe all these, tales of buried treasure, and they're going out to find it. Probably like a modern equivalent of people who gamble, or who are trying to get like a lottery ticket or something, or
it's there you go, it's a lottery ticket. Treasure digging and lottery tickets have a lot of the same impetus behind them.
Now a common criticism that
and frankly some of the same mythical thinking. It's sort of like, I'm the one that's actually going to hit this, even though the mathematical odds are terrible.
The odds are not in your favor.
We still believe, we still do it.
Oh yeah.
None of my friends have ever found treasure, but I'm going to.
Yeah, you're gonna be the lucky one. And critics, they kind of hammer on this point of Joe Smith being involved in treasure digging, and I'd be curious to get sort of your take on it, because they would say, like, if Joseph claimed that he could see buried treasure to have this gift, but then they never found any treasure, they would view his actions of he was conning people. He was a fraud. He was pretending to see buried treasure, but if they never found it, then does that not show that he's conning people? What would be your thoughts on that? Like, do you believe that Joseph sincerely believed he could see buried treasure, but there was no treasure there? Like, I don't know. I would find it hard to believe that the treasure slipped away, as some people believe. But for some, it calls into question Joseph's character, and trusting him. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Joseph certainly believed that he could see, and he had evidence of it, and other people had evidence that they believed. So when you cross over and you say he didn't find treasure, you're taking a little tiny picture rather than the big picture. So if you look at the big picture of Joseph, there's no con man there, because over here he was finding things. It's when he gets to this thing that he doesn't. Now, the con man would be selling himself as someone who would do it. Joseph is being hired. He's not going out and saying, I'm going to, try to do this. Somebody else is asking him to do it. So if he's a con man, he's going to get as much money as he can out of it and leave. But that isn't the way Joseph worked. He was hired. He stayed there. He did what, he wasn't trying to get away. There's just no evidence that he was a con man. He was a true believer. everybody that worked with him apparently was a true believer, but also a true believer in the fact that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So when they didn't find treasure, Josiah Stowel did not blame Joseph, because he knew that sometimes there was a stronger enchantment, there was a different magic. So there isn't, I don't think, any argument that Joseph was a con man.
Okay. And what do you think of, because there's different sort of faithful views or apologetic sort of interpretations I've read by that people might draw from his, engagement in folk magic using a seer stone, treasure digging. Some people on one hand would say that maybe he sincerely believed he had this gift, but he didn't, but maybe people around him thought he did. And that, that's why no treasure was found. But then God was able to use the stone that was part of his culture as a way to reveal, and for him to channel the revelation, for the Book of Mormon, to use that, something from his culture, his language and understanding. I'm curious, what's your thoughts on like this apologetic of what if he sincerely did have this gift? People reporting that he was able to find things, find lost objects, property. Maybe he did have this unique gift. When it came to treasure digging, because there's a quote from Martin Harris where he says, when one time when Joseph went to go obtain the plates, the angel reprimanded him because of his engagement with the money diggers. I think some have speculated or proposed, what if he was misusing this spiritual gift, his spiritual powers, for unrighteous purposes, should we say? And then maybe the gift didn't work in those circumstances. Like, what do you think of that possible interpretation?
I think it's quite plausible. Joseph himself said that he needed to shift away from the secular and use it only for sacred reasons. So, Joseph said that needed to be done. How quickly he got around to doing that, we probably don't have the evidence to know exactly what those timelines were and what he was doing.
I remember there's a. Oh, sorry, I was going to say, I remember reading in your book, there's a quote, and I think there's probably some validity to this quote, because Alva Hale, who's a brother of Emma, I believe, I don't think he was a supporter of Joseph, but he claimed that Joseph said to him that, I've been sort of like deceived in my treasure digging. The peeping in stones to find buried treasure is, the quote is damn nonsense, but seeing in a stone in the work of a seer is a gift from God. So maybe that was Joseph Smith realizing that he himself, treasure digging didn't work, but he still believed in the power and the gift of being a seer and using the stone.
Yeah, and it would not surprise me at all that Moroni is telling him, look, you do have a gift of the seer. And Moroni knew from, I'm sure, reading his father's book, the story of Mosiah 1 or Mosiah 2, who were both seers.
Mm-hmm.
So, Moroni would have known what a seer was and would have said, Joseph, you have that talent. This is how you're going to use it. And then Joseph had to do the mental shift to be able to change contexts from his old world where, I'm going to find a wallet and I'm going to find somebody's lost horse, to saying, no, I'm not going to use that ability in that way. I'm still going to see something, but what I'm going to do now is use it for a sacred purpose.
Right, for spiritual purposes.
The same sacred purpose that the Mosiah 1 and Mosiah 2 did. They translated records. Joseph translated a record.
Gotcha. One last question on treasure digging, and this was asked to me by a friend who's a fellow content creator, and he's come across some quotes about Joseph maybe being involved in like animal sacrifices, maybe like the killing of a dog. And I read some of those quotes, and he wanted to get my take on it because he's not seen many scholars or apologists address it specifically. And I sort of said to him, if it was one quote, we could maybe dismiss it. If there's two or three, doesn't mean like it definitely happened, but we also can't dismiss it. They're kind of concerning. Have you looked at those quotes, and do you have any thoughts on them? There could be anything
remember
to
I
them.
said that there are a whole bunch of things that were collected after the fact, where somebody's going in, they're saying, I want to get all these affidavits. Well, they're trying to get things, trying to encourage people to say bad things about Joseph.
Yeah.
And the way
especially
it
with
looks
the Hurlburt
is,
affidavits.
yeah, these are people who, who were familiar with the kinds of things that went on. And so I wouldn't be surprised that somebody was involved with animal sacrifice. I also wouldn't be surprised that they said, yeah, Joseph was, whether he was or he wasn't. These are things that had happened. People had done that. And so, okay, here's a bad story. Let me impute that one to Joseph. My take on it is that those, based on the context, the way they're being collected, and the nature of the stories, I think what we're seeing is people who know that those things happened and therefore imputed them to Joseph because they wanted, the person collecting the stories wanted something bad to say about Joseph.
Right.
So I don't necessarily think that that actually happened with Joseph. I think it actually happened with someone. And they just imputed that story to Joseph because it didn't sound good, and therefore it would make Joseph look bad. So,
Yeah, so we should maybe be a little bit more cautious or careful.
Yeah, I mean,
can't dismiss
if you're an
the statements, but
historian,
yeah.
Yeah, if you're an historian, you're looking at a record from history. You have to know where it's generated and what's behind it. And there's enough, sort of known prejudice in the way those things were collected. There are a lot of them where the language is extremely similar, and it's almost like, the guy saying, here's what I want you to say, would you sign this? So I think most of those can be put in that category. I would not surprise me again that because of the nature of folk magic, that kind of thing would have happened. But I think those are stories being ascribed to Joseph late, and under a certain kind of pressure. And I'm not sure I would accept them as historically accurate for Joseph, although I think they're historically accurate for the concept.
And we also have statements from, some of the neighbors, I believe it's in Mormonism Unveiled, where they claim that, the Book of Mormon resembles the Solom Spaulding manuscript very closely. And even I've read some statements about Sidney Rigdon being there and him writing it with Joseph Smith. And now that we have the Solom Spaulding manuscript, it doesn't match. So you can't always trust what people say or their recollections sometimes, especially if they may be antagonistic. Doesn't mean you can outright dismiss them, but maybe some caution should be had as well.
Yeah, and I think for those people who want to check out that idea, the Solomon Spaulding manuscript, I believe, is online available for free. So if people say, I wonder if it really was, and they want to read it for themselves, go ahead. Kind of boring read. You won't find it. So I can save you the trouble, but if you want to read it, it's available.
Yeah, no convergences there. And even critics like the Tanners, Dan Vogel, reject that being a possible source for not really any similarities.
Yeah, okay. Nobody who has seriously looked at the question would accept that.
Yeah,
it just doesn't work. What some people have done in order to try and resurrect it is to say, well, that's the wrong Solomon Spaulding manuscript. There's another one that's still missing, and it was that one that they meant.
Right,
but there's no evidence that there was ever another one. It's just they're inventing one that doesn't exist to keep the story going. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll transition away from seer stone treasure digging. We'll talk briefly before we get into your theories of the different translation theories. So when Joseph receives the gold plates after they go to Charles Anton, he can't translate it, and then Joseph begins translating. So I believe with Martin Harris, there's statements from Martin and from Emmet that he uses the Urim and Thummim, or the spectacles, in translation. Although I remember I brought up with Stephen Smoot how the story of Martin swapping the stones with Joseph. Yeah. So there's a bit of ambiguity. Was it only the Urim and Thummim, or was the seer stone also used during the 116 pages? But it seems that the sources indicate that after the loss of the 116 pages, it was predominantly the seer stone that was placed in the hat for the Book of Mormon as we have it today. Do you agree with that? Do you have any thoughts on the Urim and Thummim spectacles versus seer stone?
Yeah, the first thought I have is I have to correct language here. The idea that the Urim and Thummim was ever used with the Book of Mormon is wrong. How do you like that for a statement?
Explain.
The Urim and Thummim is never in the Book of Mormon. The Urim and Thummim has nothing to do with the Book of Mormon. The Urim and Thummim was never in the New World.
Right.
It was a term that at least as early as W.W. Phelps, we believe he was the earliest one, applied to the seer stones or the interpreters. And
Right.
then it became common usage. In the Book of Mormon, they're interpreters. And so a seer stone is one that Joseph had before. The interpreters are the ones that came with the plates. The Urim and Thummim is just a name that somebody applied later, frankly, because by the time they started getting members of the church, there were a lot of people coming where the shift away from that previous magical worldview was already occurring, and it
Yeah.
was getting stronger. And so people kind of wanted to distance themselves from the seer stones. And one of the ways you did it is you biblicized them by giving them the name Urim and Thummim.
I think I also saw that
So,
in I believe it's Doctrine and Covenants 8. It's funny, as a missionary, I tried to work out what the gift of Aaron was, because I was like, the gift of Aaron. Aaron's kind of like a spokesperson for Moses, but then it talked about like you know, you've held it in your hands and it's told you many things. I'm like, what the heck is this gift of Aaron? And then you know,
yeah,
I learned about in church history that in the original Book of Commandments, before it was, you know, added and changed in the Doctrine and Covenants, it was the gift of the rod. So it was
yes,
referring to a divining rod, which he had. And it appears that the change might have
yeah,
been to make it sound more biblical, to move away
yeah,
from the book magic.
yeah. And the very fact that we think of divining rods and seer stones as unusual and strange, that is an opinion that was beginning early on, and it informed the way some of the early church members reacted to the stories. And so you get things like renaming or relabeling the interpreters and the seer stones as Urim and Thummim, which makes them much more palatable. But you also get changes in the Doctrine and Covenants where you remove the rod because that's a little too strange and we want to make things a little more normal. Now, you get people who will say that Joseph never used the seer stone because they have this belief, again, coming from the occult, this other reaction to that we were talking about that says that this is black magic and all.
Kind of people
That's
like
a
the
much later
Stoddards
thing.
and things.
Yeah, but you get that still, with people in the church casts a wide net, and we get lots of different people with lots of different histories and beliefs. And some of those ideas that developed in later evangelical Christianity have come into the heritage of some of the people in the church. But that whole idea that they're trying to distance themselves, that's the reason why it faded from church history. Not that they were trying, actively trying to hide it. They were trying to sort of assimilate,
Yeah.
um, which I think, if you really think about it, is the same thing as hiding. So, however
I
you
think
want to
my
deal
impression
with
as well,
that.
looking at some of the quotes from Joseph Fielding Smith, it sounds to me like he probably genuinely believed those accounts of the seer stone were hearsay. I think he just dismissed them. He didn't believe them. So don't know how much
Oh
was
yeah, no, he
intentional
didn't.
covering, or he just didn't accept or believe it. What
Yeah,
would you
there
say?
were there were several who by the time they got around to looking at history, and they didn't have all the documents, they didn't look at that thing seriously. They just looked at the history, and that whole dichotomy of saying, we're modern people, but how do you account for Joseph and a seer stone? One of the ways of doing is by denying that he had a seer stone. But the good historical work that's been done and encouraged by the church recently, and supported and then published by the church, it's very, very clear that a seer stone was used. So yes, there was a historical time when they were trying to kind of distance themselves from it and become part of the modern world and separate themselves from that folk magic. History
Yeah.
now allows us to go back and not be as embarrassed about our history as we might have been at one time.
Right. And what would you say to those people who say the seer stone was never used? Because I've been sent a book by, I believe it's Jonathan Neville and James Lucas, which I'm going to read their book and bring them on. I think they enjoy the work I'm doing, but they disagree very much with the seer stone. I said I'll read the book and I'll engage. But to me, the thing that I always find a little bit strange is, you have statements from Martin Harris, Emma Smith, David Whitmer, who are faithful witnesses, eyewitnesses who would have been around, who would have witnessed the Book of
Yeah.
Mormon translation, but they're not claiming that, you know, it was fraud or he's making up. They're claiming it was miraculous, you know, by the gift and power
Right.
of God using the stone.
Yeah.
They're faith promoting statements, but then these people want to just reject them. And these are like prominent witnesses of the restoration. And they say, like, no, just trust, you know, because Oliver Carger, Joe Smith only mentioned Urim and Thummim. And I think they say that the Lord uses the word Urim and Thummim in the Doctrine and Covenants. So I've had one person say to me, well, who are you going to trust, the Lord, Joseph Smith, or, you know, all these other ones? But
yeah, they actually don't really know much about how the Doctrine and Covenants was put together. The Doctrine and Covenants is heavily edited and changed and altered, and, you know, as you mentioned, things like the rod are taken out.
Yeah.
What happens with those books? So the Stoddards have one, and Neville has one. For some of the statements of the faithful people who saw it, those are late statements, and they say, well, they were apostates by then and they didn't like the church, and so therefore they must be making that up.
Yeah.
In other words, they're finding excuse to deny it. The second thing is they just assume that Urim and Thummim is real. You know, when it says Urim and Thummim, it means Urim and Thummim. They don't understand that that was a generic term that was used for the interpreters. And so basically they'll say it was always the interpreters and never a seer stone.
Because my understanding, it's sort of like Urim and Thummim is the term used for both the interpreters or the seer stone, because they're both sort of seeric devices used in the translation.
Yeah, and basically, basically any of the books that are promoting that are promoting the idea and massaging history without actually doing good history. You don't have actual historians doing it. So when we were talking in the other part about, you know, scholars, you know, people who know what they're doing, looking at geography or geology, you know, there's a reason why we want to look at the people who have training in those fields, as opposed to people who are, you know, armchair geologists and saying this looks like that. We have the parallels. We talked about parallelism and the problems of that.
Yeah.
Well, when you get into these books, again, you're dealing with people who are not trained historians, who are complaining about what trained historians have found. Well, the trained historians have been through the Joseph Smith papers. The trained historians have been through all of the documents.
Yeah.
Why are they wrong? And the people who are not trained as historians and are pushing an idea that they had before they started doing the research, why are they right? There was a great, and I'm not going to get it quite right, and I believe I remember the name, Fustel de Coulanges, basically said, you know, if you start looking for something, you'll find what you were looking for. So, you know, in scholarly work, if you start with a premise and what I'm going to do is I'm going to find something that verifies my premise. Well, you'll find what you're looking for, because anything that doesn't fit, you find an excuse for and you cast off.
Yeah, you ignore it.
Historians start with the reverse and they say, where is the evidence? What does the evidence say? And then I'll collect and bring the theory.
Yeah, it's important to take all the sources into account and not just dismiss the ones, even if you don't like the implication. Because some people may be troubled with the implication of, you know, him using a seer stone and use the same seer stone in folk magic treasure digging, and they may not like that.
Yeah, and then they also stop and don't, you know, remember what happens with these seer stones after the fact, that, you know, the Urim and Thummim was dedicated on the altar, but it was a seer stone. And, you know, the descriptions tell us that it was a seer stone. So, you know, we've got those same seer stones and their history. The history itself is very strong that Joseph Smith had and did use the seer stone.
Yeah.
It is an apologetic for a particular idea where you say, I'm uncomfortable with that history and I want it to be different. Therefore, I will find things that fit my premise. And that's where those other books come from. I've read them both. And both of them are basically starting with a premise and finding any way they can to support the premise without actually doing the full historical research.
Right. Gotcha. No, I agree. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about So the Book of Mormon, I think you would agree, the time frame for, the 588 pages of the Book of Mormon as just dictated pretty much to Oliver Cowdery, who was the main scribe, was between a 2 to 3 month time period. I've heard as short as 57 days up to maybe 85 days, something in that range. Predominantly with his face buried in the hat, looking at the seer stone, dictating the words. We'll get into the mechanics. That there was the witnesses say no notes, no manuscripts, or no book open. Would you agree that that's sort of like the time period and how it was done?
Yeah, the time period has been worked out in a couple of different places. One of the most recent ones is John W. Welch has done some really good work on the time frame and gets it down to certain dates when certain things were happening. So this was being translated at this time. So there is some really good evidence of when it was translated. And it's a very, very short period of time. The other thing that's interesting is, one of the things that you'll try to do is say, well, maybe Joseph was reading some sort of a manuscript. Well, if you go back to the part that people don't want to think about, which is, Joseph was using a hat. Well, how do you use a seer stone? And it's common that the way you use any of these objects for seeing, for being a seer, is you do something that interrupts vision so that people around you know that if you see something, you're not seeing with your eyes, you're seeing with spiritual eyes, if you will. So what you do with this seer stone is you don't look at it, you put it in a hat. Well, why do you put it in a hat? Because you take the hat and you put your face in the hat. Well, why do you put your face in the hat? To obscure the light so that everybody knows you're not reading. Okay. Now, if my face is in a hat, even if I have a page to read from that's at the bottom of my hat, I don't have any light. I can't see it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the very methodology that Joseph is documented for having used tells us that he had nothing to read from, no open books, nothing to consult. He was staring in a hat, which makes it sound strange, but it
might sound goofy to people, but it does actually show that, there's no way I could have read notes or from a manuscript. Or
when you try to find other excuses for the Book of Mormon and how it was created, you kind of run up against a wall here because he couldn't see them.
Yeah.
So no matter what he had written down, now the only thing you could do is you could say he memorized it or did it extemporaneously. So William Davis has a book called Visions in the Seer Stone.
Yeah, I read that.
Suggests that that it's based on extemporaneous things, and the headers show that these are the outlines that he would use.
At the beginning of books. Each book.
Yeah, at the beginning of books, and
summary.
Again, you go back. You have to go back to the 1830 edition because we have a modern apparatus that gives us things in front of chapters, and those things weren't part of 1830. But when you go back to the 1830, there are book headers, and the book headers will say something about what's coming. And it's really, if you go to First Nephi, the book header for First Nephi is really pretty good, and you can make an argument, as Davis does, that this could be the mnemonic clue to help remember what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, it's got basically a rough outline, and it's not memorized, but he pretty much knows the story, and then he can expand upon it.
Yeah, it's possible for First Nephi. When you get to Second Nephi, it falls apart. When you get to any other book, everything falls apart, and that whole idea that there is an outline, mental outline that he's using, it just doesn't allow you to do what is happening in the Book of Mormon. So it's a really interesting idea. It just doesn't hold up against the evidence of, what we see in the text.
I think I read an interpreter article by both yourself and Brian Hales responding to it. And you brought this up in our last episode about in the Book of Ether, where it lists 30 kings, and then it talks about each of them in reverse order, and that almost stretches the credulity of what you could
the memorize. Mental tax to be able to do that. Holding first of all this long list of kings in the Book of Ether, and then when you're telling it, to reverse that and to get it right while you're telling the story when the people that are the kings aren't even the protagonists of the story many times. This is just a huge mental tax, and it's just beyond what people are going to be able to do, unless they have memorized an entire text, which is a different argument than what Davis is making. So, I don't think that one, holds up very well. Now, what is interesting and will be in a book that I'm working on right now, should cross my fingers, be out by the end of the year. It's currently being edited.
What's it about? I'm guessing something to do with the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, it's not, the title is Engraven Upon Plates Written Upon Paper. And it looks at what I would call the creative episodes that generated the English text of the Book of Mormon. So one of the creative episodes is 1830, when it's being dictated and whatever is Nephite is being turned into English. Mm-hmm. So the English is created at that time period. We know that's when, we see the result of it. And so we can examine that, but we examine that as something that happened at that time period. Then there's a second layer, which is the Nephite layer. This is what things belong to the Nephite layer that were created prior and, logically prior to the English creation of the text.
Right, on the
so
plates.
In the English creation of the text, which was the reason for mentioning this, but in the English creation of the text, I think there's some good evidence that shows Joseph Smith being extemporaneous in the way he's translating. That where we can see Joseph, if you will, translating on the fly. There's certain instances where you can see him making some mistakes in translating and having to sort of redo it. They're called corrective ors. And it's sort of like, shoot, I just said the wrong thing, or what I meant was. But I think those are really good evidence that Joseph Smith is translating, but he's translating as he goes and sometimes gets ahead of himself in the translation. And I think that fits with everything I know about the way the translation worked. But as far as, William Davis's idea of extemporaneous, I don't see it explaining any big structures, but I do see it in some of these small phrases where there's some evidence of extemporaneous production.
Yeah, building off of an outline. Another part as well with the Book of Mormon, the complexity is, the geography, how internally consistent it is. And in order for that to make sense, he would have to have had a map in his head somehow memorized, because there's no evidence of him, drawing out a map of, Book of Mormon geography as, scholars do. And that's also something that would be pretty hard to imagine that he was able to have it in his mind perfectly memorized and how everything fits, because it doesn't contradict with each other as far as I believe.
Yeah, and I've spent the last several years going through looking at how it was written and what Mormon does. And you start looking at how this text was constructed and how carefully it's put together. It just doesn't follow rules that Joseph would have known. Chapters are not created in the way we expect chapters to be created. The stories are told differently. The reason why the stories are told are different. The way Mormon uses names has only, we got some indication of it several years ago when Gordon Thomason wrote a paper talking about metonymy and names and how certain names would have meaning. And the more I look at it, the more it becomes apparent that Mormon used names the way he wanted to use names and not because that's the way they showed up in history. I cannot guarantee you that anybody had the name that their mama gave them because Mormon uses names for his own purposes.
We see that in the Bible as well, don't we, with certain names? Sort of like
the Bible certainly
stories.
Does that same thing. Yeah, I mean, this is an ancient technique. This is not unusual. And because Mormon wasn't an historian and he was telling a theological story, of course he wanted all the pieces to fit correctly. So the fact that he would alter some names does not alter the veracity of history, the historicity of the text, and frankly, it makes it more of an ancient text when you see those kinds of things happening. But anyway,
Right.
Where are we in the conversation?
So
I
where
got us
I think
off
it's
on a
now time
tangent.
to talk about the nature of the translation. I think this was leading up to
Okay.
that point. So in your book, you talk about three maybe theories or views of translation. There's the literal, which is more like a word for word translation. There's conceptual translation, and then there is functional translation, which is the one which you hold to. I want to read this week quote because I think this ties in quite well, and then we'll go into this about Book of Mormon historicity, because your theory for the translation, obviously assuming the Book of Mormon is historical, and we've talked about in previous episodes, sort of like why you believe that there's a case for Book of Mormon historicity. This quote doesn't come from me; I got it from LDS Truth Claims, but it says the question of the Book of Mormon's historicity is simple. If it has historicity, it is a translation of an ancient document, just as it claims. If it has no historicity, then it is a modern document making deceptive claims about history. The Book of Mormon isn't a text from history. It declares that it is a translation of a text from history, and thus the expectation that it should reflect an ancient culture that produced it will be mixed with a virtually inevitable presence of the world of the translator that presents the text in terms that make sense to the culture and time of the translator. I think that quote kind of fits in quite well with your view of conceptual translation. And if the Book of Mormon has some historicity, if there are some ancient elements or things which align with what we know about ancient geography in the Old World and the New World, then understanding even what perceived to be maybe 19th century phraseology, King James Bible passages, anachronism, if it has historicity, then it's a translation of an ancient text. So we're working off that belief or assumption that the Book of Mormon is historical. So let's try to understand the nature of the translation. So maybe before we dive into sort of each one specifically, maybe in around a minute or less, could you explain briefly what is a literal translation, what is a conceptual, and then what's a functional?
A literal translation, the way that's being used is you come as close as you can to a word for word translation. And those work reasonably well when you're in the similar language family. So, for example, if you're doing a literal translation from Spanish to French, it may work relatively well because those are related languages. If you are doing it from, for example, Quiche to English, it doesn't work. Alan Christensen actually has a copy of the Popol Vuh where he has that literal translation, and then he has the kind of translation that we would expect. And you look at me and go, okay, those are not the same. And then you read the literal translation and you're saying, I'm not sure I understand that, because there's so many things going on in the Quiche that don't happen in English. So a word for word literal translation works only in certain circumstances.
Okay.
A conceptual translation is one that says, the heck with the words. I'm just going to translate whatever I think it means. And there was a translation, I think it was called the Good News Bible, that was a conceptual translation. And it wasn't very close at all. And if you have read the scriptures and learned to love them, you read this one, you're going, I don't recognize this. It just doesn't look at all the same, because it just completely modernizes. So the conceptual translation doesn't have to be tied very closely to the original text. The functional translation is tied to the text in that it is trying to represent correctly the intent of what was there. But it understands that intent is culturally determined and linguistically determined and may require different words to explain them correctly. So, for example, we have in English the idiom to kick the bucket. Well, if I kicked the bucket, I died, right? My friend kicked the bucket. Well, we know that means he died. How do you translate that? If you translate that literally to someone else, all of a sudden they're kicking a bucket. They haven't died, they're actually physically kicking a bucket, which they weren't doing. So if you're going to take an idiom, you must translate the concept of the idiom, because translating it word for word won't work. but you want to be faithful to what the idiom is trying to say. So you might translate one idiom in one language to a similar idiom in another language to show that it was an idiomatic expression, but convey the correct meaning.
In their
I
own
don't
sort
know
of
if I managed to
vernacular
do that in your
vocabulary.
time period, but yeah.
Gotcha. I
But
think in your book,
that's what I think happens. Yeah, I was gonna say that's what I think happens in the Book of Mormon is that they're trying to get the right meaning, but it has to be translated into an English that people will understand.
gotcha. And I think those three definitions they're more specific than, I would have used in the past, just tight versus loose. And tight would have been, the very literal word for word, and loose would have been more general. But I think it's good to distinguish between conceptual and functional as well. So we'll talk about each of the three maybe in detail, and if there's anything in the Book of Mormon, any evidence to support that, or any problems with maybe that view of the translation. So maybe we'll start with literal, which is the more word for word translation. And this would have been my assumption growing up in the church. Not that I think I was explicitly taught, but I just would have assumed not just the Book of Mormon, but all scripture, particularly, the Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price was, inerrant, that it was word for word, coming from God to Joseph Smith. I almost would have assumed that God speaks to people in King James Bible English. That's just how God talks. That's religious speech. And also, the witnesses as well, such as Martin Harris, David Whitmer, Emma Smith, when you look at their statements, their eyewitness testimonies, and we talked about this in our last episode, they believe that a character was appearing on the stone, and then the English translation that Joe Smith was reading the translation. So he wasn't doing the translation himself, but it was appearing on the stone, and that he was reading it word for word, and it had to be written down correctly. And then they couldn't move to the next sentence. The next character wouldn't appear until it was written down correctly. So they would support more of a tight, literal word for word, and also probably an inerrant view of the translation.
Yeah, and I'm glad you used the word inerrant, because that meaning and that concept and that expectation is a religious heritage that was brought into Mormonism. We brought that as our language because that was the expectation that converts had. And so you didn't discard that, you just sort of developed it and accepted it because the Book of Mormon was from God, therefore it was inerrant because the Bible was inerrant. It didn't work terribly well when you start looking at it. And so Royal Skousen is the one who came up with this concept of ironclad and tight and loose.
Yes.
And what he called ironclad is what we're looking at as a literal translation. And he looks at these statements and he says, yes, there is evidence that they would have seen something being corrected, but it was always names. There's evidence that names were corrected in the Book of Mormon.
Spelt out.
There's no evidence that something else was corrected, only names. And then it was only the first time that it happened. They could drift after that. So their statement was correct, but it doesn't define the way the whole Book of Mormon was created. They assumed that because they saw that and they had this concept of inerrantism and applied it. But the actual evidence says you don't have this ironclad. What they saw, they misinterpreted as the ironclad, and that was not correct.
Right. So you're saying that they would have perceived when Joseph Smith was correcting the spelling of a name that everything that they were writing was being corrected, that had to be spelt correctly. There couldn't be any grammatical problems, any errors.
Yeah, and a lot of this is, I think, Joseph never sold them. Nobody ever saw what Joseph saw. And so they're trying to come up with, in their mind, with explanations. And they know what they perceived or what they saw or what they heard because the translation was happening right around them, or they were around the translation rather. So they heard these things and then they extrapolated that into the meaning of, well, every single word was perfect.
Right.
So yes, there's evidence that some things were corrected. There's a lot of evidence that other things weren't. And certainly when we get into the copy that was made, the printer's manuscript, again, Royal Skousen is the place to go for this. But there are places where in the extant version of the original, we can see that there was an error made in the printer's manuscript.
Right.
So
if
yeah,
you hold an inerrantist, a
yeah,
perfect word for word translation, the evidence
isn't
from
going
the
to
original
work.
manuscript pretty much debunks that.
Yeah, the evidence is against it. So, something else is happening. So
Right.
then we have the question of, what Skousen is calling tight, or I would call more the literalist.
Hmm.
And then his loose translation, which I think is more for him the conceptual. And I think what happens is too many people go with the conceptual and say, well, once you break it from the word for word, then you break all ties to the text and you can make up anything you want. And that's this slippery slope argument.
Yeah,
I
because
think you have to
Blake
consider
Oster's is a
that.
little bit more similar. Don't want to misrepresent him, because in our interview, you talked about that he would view some things as type, but his would probably fall a little bit more under the category of conceptual, more of an expansion, similar to the Book of Moses when Joseph is reading through, Genesis, and then he receives this revelatory expansion of the Book of Moses and the
Yeah.
Book of Enoch, and that could be viewed more as like a conceptual translation. He wasn't translating, word for word from some sort of ancient text or document.
Yeah. And when Blake first came out with that, there were a lot of people who were unhappy with it because they had this inerrant view of the Book of Mormon. And again, it's the slippery slope thing. They're saying, oh, well, Joseph was making things up. And if you don't like the translation, you can just say it was what Joseph made up. And I think you have to be
Right.
more careful than that.
I thought he did a great job of acknowledging, and you do as well, and we'll discuss this more in your functional view of the translation. But he addresses a lot of maybe like the King James Bible passages, 19th century elements, and he tries to incorporate that into his view, which I really appreciated. I remember, I talked to Michael Ash, and there were some things where I maybe wouldn't align with him. So when I asked him, for example, about Deutero-Isaiah passages, he maybe viewed it as like, oh, they probably weren't on the plates, but it's, it's part of maybe, just being more of a co-author or revelatory expansion. And for me, I always find that a bit in the realm of like, oh, it's a wee bit indistinguishable from, was he just making it up? So I prefer sort of like the functional view of the translation, that yes, it's Joseph's vernacular, his vocabulary, phraseology, but it's working off, trying to translate the meaning, the intent that was on the plates.
Yeah, as I have continued to look at the Book of Mormon, I think you find certain elements that are literal. You find the majority of them that are functional, and I think there are a few that you can define as conceptual. Okay. But I think the difference between just saying, you can't categorize it and say this is how the whole of the Book of Mormon happened. And when you say that a certain thing happened in a certain way, I think you need an argument, and I think you need a reason. So, for example, if I'm going to say that most of the text is functional, meaning that it's trying to communicate what the text said as close as possible, but in a way that can be understood in the modern world, if that's what it's doing, then what happens when I say something is literal? Well, in my case, I look at it and I said, the only one I can find are names. Names appear to be, dictated. There's a reason for those names being there. And what we keep finding, and this happened, a lot of this is coming after I wrote the book. There's a lot more evidence that these names are significant. The names have meanings. The names are used in the text in specific ways. Mormon really makes use of names in ways that I had not understood when I was writing that book. So there is something that's literal. What is? Names. Why names? Because the names are so important to the meaning of the text that if you don't have the name communicated correctly, you're not going to get the information you need. And in one case, for example, we have a place where there's a possible spelling error that has created something that may camouflage a meaning. There are certain names in the Book of Mormon that have a root, Hebrew root of MLK, which has the meaning of king. So the obvious one is Mulek, MLK, M-U-L-E-K.
Yes, Mulek.
MLK names. So MLK names are used two ways, one as descendants of Mulek, but also as proponents of the king. So that ties with Mulek, who was the son of a king. We have people who are called the Amlicites, or a person who is Amlici, and it's an A-M-L-I-C-I. Skousen has evidence that sometimes that C was pronounced hard and not soft, so that the better spelling would have been a K instead of a C. And so it would have been Amlici instead of Amlici.
Right.
Well, the Amlici doesn't fit, but the Amlici is an MLK name. And all of those people fit the concept of the MLK names. So it's entirely possible that there is, because of the way the scribe wrote it, we've got a spelling error that is allowing us to miss something that we would otherwise have seen. And there are times when they are spelled Amalekai. So it looks like it could be just a spelling variant and should be the MLK name. So anyway, back to the point. If I'm going to say that there is an exception, I need to have an excuse for it. I need to have a reason for it. Why is this different from anything else? The same thing happens if I'm saying it's a functional translation, and then I say, here is something that is conceptual. I have to have a reason why it's conceptual. I have to have something where I can say, this is why this is put in there as conceptual. And in my case, I probably see fewer conceptual things than apparently Mike Ash or maybe even Blake Ostler do. But we have the reworking of Isaiah 27. When it's retold in Nephi, it's really obviously the Martin Harris, Charles Anthon story. That's informing it. Well, that's fulfilled history. That's where Joseph is seeing whatever is on the plates and looking at fulfilled history and saying, oh, I know what that meant. And it's translating his perception from fulfilled history
That's very specific
onto the text. And that's the way it's being translated. So do I think that Nephi wrote it down so that it was so clearly Martin Harris and Charles Anthon? No, I think he wrote it down the way Nephi had, or the way Isaiah had it. But this expression of it, the very specific nature of it, and then we get the other one where Joseph says, there's the prophecy that's going to be Joseph, who's named for his father, and you're going, okay, yeah, that's a modern fulfillment of prophecy. So I think if you're going to say there's something conceptual in there, you do it by saying there's a reason for it. I can explain why. You don't ever want to go into this and say, what's the reason why you think this is conceptual? Well, because it's awkward and I can't explain it any other way. That's not a good excuse.
Gotcha. And going back to the literal view for a wee second, you're talking about some of the names in the Book of Mormon. I've read, some scholars point to, some names, rooted in ancient antiquity, ancient Egyptian sounding names, or Hebrew. I think names like Behoran, Pakumenai, Gideani or something like that. Those sorts of names, sounding like ancient Egyptian names and some ancient Hebrew names as well. So having some antiquity in the names, and those beings were like literal, word for word translations making it into the text. Yeah,
and the other one that we don't think about and it really hits people wrong is there's Timothy. There's a couple of very obvious Greek names in there, and people are saying, well, what are Greek names doing in there? And they forget that, Alexander the Great conquered in 300. Let's see, 300? Maybe I've got it wrong on that one. But anyway, there were Greek names that were showing up in Israel, and so they could have brought them over with them. I remember one, though, Mark Wright was looking at one of the ones that was there and says, what would happen if I translated this into Maya? And I can't remember if it was Timothy or whichever one it was. But whatever it was, in Maya, you have syllables. And then you would translate, the glyph would be a syllable, a consonant and a vowel together. So you'd have one glyph for ba and another for be and another for bu. So he takes this and he says, what would happen if I turned that into a Maya name? And he said, it turns out to be burning mosquito. Weird. He says, and then I found a text somewhere or a painting or glyph that's talking about burning mosquitoes. So does that mean anything? Yeah, that didn't mean anything at all. But it's really fascinating to think that there is a possibility that we have the word Timothy there, but it was actually a Maya name that got somehow retranslated back into something more understandable.
Right. That's really interesting. And I've seen scholars also point to like Jershon, being like a land of inheritance, and that in Hebrew I think means inheritance. Nahum, they point to that being sort of a Hebrew word, and that they find NHM and other ancient names. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, and that's why I say that the names were so important to the meaning of the text that I think that's a good reason why they were literal when other things were not.
Yeah, gotcha. So I thought it'd be good to talk for a bit about more the functional view of the translation and how it accounts for maybe certain things which some people would point to as 19th century elements or criticisms leveled against. And I think you also say in the book that you're saying this is probably the best theory, maybe based upon the evidence in your view, but you're not claiming that for 100%. We're all sort of having to theorize, because Joseph Smith, he's the only one that really knew, and all he said is, it was by the gift and power of God, and it's not for the world to know all the details of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. So we're all left here, talking amongst ourselves, trying to work out how most likely it would have happened.
Oh yeah, it's entirely likely I get to the afterlife and I meet Joseph and he said, "Yeah, I was really amused by everything you said. You're wrong." It's entirely possible.
That would be funny. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit about then to do with the functional view of the translation. So let's just briefly talk about inerrancy. You would say that the Book of Mormon, the original manuscript, doesn't support it being an inerrant Book of Mormon. Whenever I first learned after our mission about either changes made to grammar, but some of the small changes like changing Mary being like the mother of God to the mother of the Son of God, or Mosiah to Benjamin, or white and delightsome to pure and delightsome. Those things really shocked me, because I had this view of like, this is literally God speaking. You can't change scripture. And some people might say that if there's bad grammar in there, if there's been changes, and the book more refers to itself as being like the most correct of any book, and the article of faith that says like, we believe the Bible as far as is translated correctly, but we believe the Book of Mormon to be the word of God. What would be your response to someone who holds an inerrantist view and is troubled by either errors or changes made in subsequent Book of Mormon editions?
The nature of prophetic translation is one where our best evidence is that the prophetic translator is trying to communicate something and does the best that he can. And I say he because that's the only ones that we have. Women could do the same thing, but that's not, I'm not excluding women. It's just the historical males here, Joseph in particular. But if you look at, for example, the Doctrine and Covenants, the Doctrine and Covenants was for a while received through a seer stone. And then later, Joseph wasn't using a seer stone, but he was still getting revelation. And the descriptions of the revelation, basically, without the seer stone, are very similar to the way he used the seer stone. So nothing seems to have changed when Joseph stopped using the seer stone. What we know in the Doctrine and Covenants is that Joseph was quite willing to go back and say, that didn't do what I thought it should. It did not quite communicate what God meant. And so paragraphs could get added and things could get changes. There were dramatic changes from the original to what we have published. And many of them by Joseph Smith, where Joseph is saying, that did not, obviously when you look at it, it did not correctly communicate. What he adds is an expansion that says, this is what this means.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Book of Mormon, we don't get very much of that because he is tied to a text. He's translating. He's not, just giving revelation. But the concept is still there that Joseph Smith might have made a mistake or that something needed to be corrected. And I talked about the corrective ors and things that I'm looking at in this new book that look at Joseph's mind as he participated in the translation. So we get his worldview informing the language that he uses. It's not shocking if somebody is speaking English and they use an English idiom. It's not shocking if he uses language that's familiar to him coming from the Bible. Of course, he's going to do that because he's very familiar with the language. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about any of those kinds of things because they're not with the way Joseph translated.
Mm-hmm.
And some of you have to look at each change again and find out why it was made. Poor grammar. Royal Skousen and Stanford Carmack have recently suggested that it's not really poor grammar, it's really authentic early modern English grammar. I disagree with that. I think it's imitative pseudo-biblical language. In other words, he's imitating the King James Version language. And sometimes he does it right, sometimes he does it wrong. Sometimes when he gets something wrong, it happens to be the way people got it, used it in English before we changed our mind.
Did you talk about in your book as well? You mentioned about some of those maybe rural communities might have had like archaic English dialect. And is there any evidence that
and
Smith
I think
may
I
have
was
spoken
wrong.
with that sort of grammar?
Yeah, and I was wrong on that.
You're wrong. Okay.
Yeah, I have. It really isn't a local dialect. It isn't that kind of thing. It's not being preserved. This is pseudo-archaic language. This is language that Joseph is trying to imitate. Lots of other people did it. It was common at the time. That's the reason you find it in the Great War. Up through 1830, this is just what was expected. The language that was expected to show that this was an authentic work or a good, important work. But it replicates and is very similar to other ways that the language was used. And the mistakes in it show that it's not a native speaker. So yeah, and I don't remember that I had written that, but now that you remind me, I'm embarrassed because I was wrong.
Okay.
We should strike that.
Okay. Scratch that part out. I'll rip it out of the book. But you
Take
wouldn't
those
align
pages
with
out.
our view of it being a 16th century translation and that it's not really bad grammar coming from Joseph Smith.
I mean, it really is bad grammar, but why do you worry about that? I mean, if Joseph Smith is the translator, God isn't the translator, Joseph is.
Mm-hmm.
God isn't the one selecting the language. Now, God may be the one, and I do believe that God is the one who is providing the information, providing the meaning. But the words
Understanding of the
Joseph is the one
translation.
choosing the words, not God. So yeah, there's bad grammar, but it's Joseph's fault, not God's.
Right.
Now, we do have to go back to that statement you made about the Book of Mormon being the most correct book because, or even about the Bible being translated correctly, because those get misinterpreted. When Joseph is saying that the Book of Mormon is the most correct book, he has no idea and no intent of saying that there's no errors. It's the most correct book because it teaches doctrine correctly. That's why
Right.
it's the most correct. So it's not the most correct because it was translated perfectly or anything else. Now, there is only one
Message,
translator.
principles.
Yeah, and so when you get to the article of faith that says the book, the Bible translated correctly, well, there's been a lot of translators and there's been a lot of different languages and there's a lot of different interpretations. And if you look even at the various, good translations of the Bible, you'll find that there are some where the scholars say, well, okay, this is an evangelical translation. When it came to making a choice, they did it based on their theology rather than the theology of the original text. Well, that's a modern book. That happens in translations of the Bible now. So when you say the Bible as translated correctly, what they mean is, when that original meaning is correctly transmitted. And you have to worry about that because different Bible translations will have different meaning. There's only one translation of the Book of Mormon into English. They've translated into other languages and they're very careful about how they do that. But there's only one into English, and so it's as good as we're going to get. We can work with the interpretations of that. But Joseph never claimed that it was inerrant and never claimed that it was, now, one of the things that did happen is John Gilbert says there's a lot of grammatical errors and stuff here. You want me to fix them as I go through them? Joseph said, no, let them stand. So a lot of those grammatical errors Joseph let go through, but we don't know exactly why he said that, but clearly not because he thought it was going to be inerrant.
Right. And he later revised them, and some of his sort of associates, they would have went through both the revelations, and as you talked about, they would have tried to edit and revise the language. So it's clear he didn't have an inerrantist view. I think neither did Brigham Young. I think there was a statement in your book where he talked about the Lord commanded the Book of Mormon to be translated. In today's, it would, the language and vocabulary would differ from the current translation. So there's many leaders that didn't hold that literal word for word inerrant translation. Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe we could touch on for a wee minute on the mechanics of the translation in your view. You talk about that a little bit in your book, as we talk about the witnesses believe that the words appeared word for word on the stone, and that Joseph was more of a reader than a translator. Now, according to Royal Scouts, and he says that the evidence of the manuscript supports that he was dictating about 20 to 30 words at a time, and you would believe that he was maybe seeing words, but maybe not on the stone. What's your view of like the actual mechanics and how he was seeing the words and dictating them?
This is where things get really interesting because nobody knows anything, and so you try to come up with the best explanations that you can. And for me, I think that one of the places to look for some of the explanations is humanity. I think we look at who we are and what people have done in the past. What are the mechanisms that we already have? So without, trying to invoke absolute miracle, what do we know that human beings can do? Well, there's a couple of things that we have to ask. And one of them is, how does Joseph see words on a stone if a stone doesn't have words and he's got his face in the hat? How does he see anything, and particularly how does he see words? Andrew Lang was an anthropologist in the late 1800s who was fascinated with seer stones, crystal balls, and he had a crystal ball and he would take it to different people and ask them if they could see something in it, and most of them would say no. Some people would, and they would see pictures, they'd see something in there. And his conclusion was there are some people who are talented and can see with the crystal ball, and some people who can't. But the one that's fascinating is he took this crystal ball and he gives it to a young girl, and the girl looks at it and sees a piece of paper with words on it. And it's so real to her, she turns the ball over to find the piece of paper. Now, what does that tell us? That tells us that it is possible for a human being, there's some mechanism that a human being, without invoking the divine, that somehow in their mind are able to see a piece of paper with words on it. Well, if the young girl could do it, now we can say that whatever mechanism, whatever brain function allowed her to do that, Joseph could have used. Now, what brain functions do we have? And I go into some of the problems of, the issues of vision and memory and those kinds of things. But, in essence, what we're looking at is we can, any of us can close our minds and we can imagine a picture. Some people are really, really good at that and they can see pictures. Joseph apparently was one of those people because that was the talent he had with the seer stone, is seeing things. And we have, evidence of the fact that, it wasn't that he just got impressions, he saw something. So now the question is, how does, that seeing get him, how does that turn into words on, that he reads? And I think the Lord just, tweaks whatever neurons need to be tweaked to be able to get the right picture. So the mechanism for being able to see, I think we can explain through natural means. The Lord has to be involved in it, but I think the Lord uses natural means and things that other people have done so that Joseph could see words on the paper. Now, the second question then is, where do those words come from? So, it's one thing to say there's words on the paper, but now where did the words come from? And again, what Royal Skousen is saying is somebody else translated it, and that translation was given to Joseph
on the stone.
I don't think
which
that
he read.
I don't think there's good evidence for it. I think there's some real good evidence that that didn't happen, that Joseph was again translating on the fly, and that Joseph is the source of the words. Well, where do we get this? Well, again, I turn to the real world of what we know about the brain, which is looking at cognitive linguistics. And Steven Pinker is the one that I cite, who's done a lot of work on sort of how does the brain turn whatever we have into speech? How do we know what to say? And in his looking at things, he came up with a term called mentalese. And in his term, mentalese is the language of the brain before it becomes language. Some of the people who have read my book have not understood. I think I did not explain very well, because they think that mentalese means you're just making stuff up. And that's not what the mechanism is. Mentalese is pretty precise. Mentalese is behind anything we have. And I know Mike Ash was saying that he didn't think that it worked because you've got certain things that are very specific. Doesn't matter. Mentalese produces English or produces language, and it can be very precise because I can produce a mathematical formula. But the language that has to be generated to produce that formula has to come from somewhere. So I may have this nebulous formula, but in order to turn it into language, something has to happen. And what he says is it's mentalese, and we, have this one step lower than, than our cognition of what we're saying. And so one of the things that he mentioned is that we have all had the experience of saying, well, that's not what I meant to say. And my wife any number of times will say, well, why did you say this? And I said, well, that's not what I said. I said such and such. She said, no, you didn't. You said this word. And I'm thinking, well, no, I didn't. I said that word. Well, one of the two of us is wrong. And it's probably me, not because of the word I said, because my mentalese had the right word. Somehow I got translated into the wrong word, and that's what she heard, but it wasn't what I was thinking I was going to say. So right. Somewhere in that process of elevating meaning into language, a wire got tripped and something didn't happen correctly. But all of that is evidence saying mentalese is a way of pre-language, and it can be very precise. It can hold the gist of things, and we know that memory holds the gist of things unless we specifically try to memorize something. So it can be very specific, but more often than not, it's going to be, if you will, functional. It's going to take a meaning and it will translate it into language. I don't know, and how many of your viewers and how often you have, if you've ever written a paper and you go back over it and you say, okay, that paragraph isn't very good, I have to rewrite it.
Yeah.
And you change it around. The underlying meaning is still the same. You just need to produce different words to correctly express the meaning. I was never wrong about the meaning. I knew what the meaning was. I did not express it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a difference between mentalese and the produced speech. And what I think happened is God simply gives to Joseph the meaning of what the text said, and he gives it to him in mentalese. And Joseph translates that by saying, here's that meaning, I'm going to put it into English.
Right,
so
he's declothed it in language, his vernacular. Yeah. And do you believe, I know you talk about this in your book, but for my viewers, do you believe he was seeing the words in his mind, or do you think like he was translating his mind and then it went to the stone? What's your view of like, where he was seeing the words?
I think it's in his mind. And the reason I think that is it can't be his eyes. He's got his head in the hat. There's no light coming in. There's no way his eyes are functional at this point in time. Now, we could make up a luminous stone. We could do what some people say
Yeah,
is,
unless
oh
God
yeah,
lights the stone, the
yeah,
spiritual.
I put my iPhone in the bottom of the hat and it glowed and told me words. We could say that, but there's no evidence for it. What we do know is that the mind is capable of seeing, and that just like that girl could see in the stone, it wasn't in the stone, it was in her mind. That's where she saw. And that's where I think Joseph sees this. I don't think he sees it through vision. I don't think the stone had words on it. I think the stone is his understanding of how he sees. I think he has the talent to do that, and the cultural expectation of the expression of that talent is to use a stone.
So you don't
But
think you
eventually he
think the stone
stops
was more
using the
like
stone.
an aid or to help channel the
Yeah.
revelation? What do
Well,
you
and
make
we know it
of
functioned that.
oh, sorry, I was
Well,
gonna say,
and this is the point I wanted to make is, we know it functions that way because he started getting revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants, and then he stopped using the seer stone and still got revelation.
that's
So
right.
he did not need it.
Yeah.
He used it, but did not need it. The mechanism, his ability to do it was the same. His early perception of how he could do it was culturally bound to the concept of this is how it's done. And then at some point in time, he realized, yeah, I don't need the way it was done in the past. I can now do it more directly.
And it appears that
So I
David
don't think,
Whitmer had some issues with that.
yeah,
But a lot of the early witnesses, they sort of believed that it was the stone was the translator, and the stone almost had like a kind of, it was a magical stone, like it had magical
oh, of
powers.
course, yeah.
What was the question I was going to ask you? Oh, so somebody might push back and say, what about when Martin Harris swaps the
Yeah.
stone and then he puts in a similar resembling stone, and then Joseph Smith can't translate it, and he's like, all is as dark as Egypt, and then Martin, admits that, I swapped the stones, to see that you weren't just memorizing sentences, and people might interpret that as he couldn't translate with a different stone, he could only translate it with that stone, indicating that he was seeing words on the stone. What would be your take on that? I know you mentioned it in the book. You do address it.
Yeah. And, certainly that would be, the interpretation that Martin had. And it was an important one because it allowed him to continue to support the translation. I think it's just as easy to say God knew that Martin needed to have that confirmation, so he didn't give Joseph the translation. So yeah, I don't think we need the stone. I think we need God, and we need divine intervention, but we don't need the stone.
Gotcha.
And I think God knew that Martin needed that confirmation, so that's why the event turned out the way it did.
Okay. So let's go back to talking not so much about the mechanics now, but the text, the nature of functional translation. So a few things I have in here. So you believe it captures the meaning of the plates and the structure of the plates. Those things come through, but the language, the vocabulary, vernacular is very much based upon the translator and his language. He's expressing, clothing it in language, basically the meaning of the plates. And I think a lot of the biggest criticisms against things in the text of the Book of Mormon are probably more attacking the literalist word for word view of the translation. So things like anachronisms, King James Bible passages, New Testament passages, Protestant Christianity, revivalist phrases. Those are all things I read in Grant Palmer's book, which is one of the first things I encountered in my faith crisis, and I found it just completely devastating to a literalistic word for word translation. So maybe we could talk about each one and get your view under more the functional translation. So maybe we could start with anachronisms in the Book of Mormon. So things like horses, elephant, wheat, steel, goats, sheep, pigs, are at the moment things which are anachronistic in Mesoamerica to Book of Mormon times. What would be your view of those anachronisms under your view of the translation being functionally equivalent? Do you see it as maybe we've just not discovered it with archaeology? Is this maybe loan shifting coming from, the Nephites naming a new animal and calling it, something that, resembles, it looks similar to a horse? or is it a translator's anachronism? Like, what's your take on it?
I really think they're translator anachronisms. I don't think it's an accurate translation of a lone shift. Now, the lone shift works, and the lone shift tells you why it's a translator anachronism. It just isn't a. The question is, where is the lone shifting happening? Is it happening with the Nephite text or with Joseph? And I think it's happening with Joseph. So these are translator anachronisms. And for those who aren't familiar with what a translator anachronism would be, if you're familiar with the King James Bible, we are familiar with the admonition that we shouldn't put our candle under a bushel. Well, both candle and bushel are anachronisms.
Yes.
They didn't, the original text, they don't have tallow candles. They don't have, they have oil lamp, but they don't have candles. And a bushel is a specific kind of basket and measure, and they didn't have those either. So does that mean that the Bible is wrong because it has candle and bushel? No, those are translation anachronisms. The Bible will mention a unicorn. Does that mean that there really was a unicorn? No, it's a translation anachronism. So yeah, it's not surprising to have a translation anachronism, and they all fit into the world that Joseph would have known. So in a lot of cases, I think what's happening is he's doing the lone shifting and saying, yeah, this is the best I've got. This is what it would be. Then when you look at some of them, for example, like the horse, I would make a strong argument that it's translation anachronism because a horse never does a horse thing in the Book of Mormon. There's a really good analysis of this coming out from Brian Hales in a book that should be out very soon that talks about the importance of horse culture and why that never shows up in the Book of Mormon and why that's important.
Right.
So look forward to Brian Hales' book.
Yeah, I think you talked to me about that.
Did he?
And yeah, so you would lean towards, because I know there's been some not definitive findings of maybe horse bones, pre-Columbian times, the end of Book of Mormon times. Would you still lean towards, even if they found horse bones, for example, that dated Book of Mormon times, would you still think it might still be a translator's anachronism because it doesn't function?
Yeah, and let's back up. It's not even if they have. We have carbon-14 dating that goes into pre-Columbian, but not quite Book of Mormon times, but times when horses aren't supposed to be there.
Right, gotcha.
But they do have them now. And so all of a sudden you go, oh, wait a minute, there are pre-Columbian horses. Does that say anything for the Book of Mormon? No, because they still didn't have horse culture. We don't know what they were doing with them, but it did not affect anything in the Book of Mormon. So from the standpoint of the Book of Mormon, it's nice to say, oh yeah, they had a horse, but it's still important to know that horse culture never developed there. So, we don't know what they were using, and maybe it was a horse, but it just wasn't a horse doing horse things.
Right. Okay. And what would you say to those people? Because I have some ex-members or critical listeners who might think that the whole either lone shifting or translator's anachronism is quite either a weaselly or a convenient way for basically, if the Book of Mormon makes a claim but it's anachronistic, that you can sort of get around it. So like anything it claims in the Book of Mormon, so like, okay, it wasn't a horse, but a deer or a tapir or an elephant, maybe more like a mammoth sort of a creature, or a pig was maybe a peccary, and they're sort of like saying like, oh, it's a way to get round. Or like a goat, I think, is it the red brocket deer is been suggested by like Matthew Roper, and they almost see it as like, is this sort of grasping at straws or making excuses? What would you say to that?
I would say that actually would be a really strong argument if there were no other arguments for the Book of Mormon. If we had no other evidence for the Book of Mormon and we were simply making up stuff to make it look good, I'd say they had a darn good point.
Yeah.
If we go back to everything that we talked about in the other episodes about Mesoamerica and how it fits and how the context of the Book of Mormon works, with that layer of convergences that say there really is something here, now this other stuff is translation. And we can say that it's translation because we have a solid foundation of something else. So if the only thing you're looking at is that and you're saying, oh yeah, you're making that up. Okay, yeah, it could be if I had nothing else to support it. But when I've got that solid foundation, these things now become logical translation anachronisms. And I can say they are because I've got a good foundation of historical information that is more powerful than saying I have to make an excuse for a horse not being a horse or a goat not being a goat.
Right.
So yeah, they would have a good one. But again, we talked about these parallels. That's also the problem of arguments against the Book of Mormon. If you take a little tiny thing and say these things don't match up, but you don't look at the rest of the evidence, then it might look like it's a strong argument, but not when you look at the whole of the evidence.
I really like that response. I actually did a video on anachronisms, and I could see, you know, the critics' view on some of these, it could almost seem like excuses. And I would agree with you. If nothing else supported the Book of Mormon, then probably this loan shifting or translators anachronism probably wouldn't be a very strong defense. But I like how you said that you take it into account with all of the evidence that supports both in, you know, the old world, the new world, things that seem to have some ancient antiquity to the Book of Mormon, and then maybe understanding some of those issues in light of the translation. I think it needs to be taken into account, the things for it, and then to understand some of the things against.
Yeah, and let me put it into a little bit different context that I just thought of. If you are a scientist and you are working on a hypothesis, you'll come up with a hypothesis and you say, here's all of the data, and the data point to this particular conclusion. But I've got some outlying points of data. I've got some things over here that don't fit this. Any good hypothesis will say, here's the hypothesis and here's the strength. Here's the outlying data, but here is the reason why we can explain the outlying data.
Right, we're trying to account for it.
Yeah, you account for it, and so that's the way I look at these, issues of loan shifting and translator anachronisms. These are explaining the peripherals. We've got the big solid hypothesis here. There are data that don't look like they fit. Can I come up with a good reason why those things exist and still fit my thesis? And if it's a reasonable explanation that accounts for them, great. If they come out here and I can't do it, then I've got a problem. Well, if I have, for example, an inerrantist view of the translation of the Book of Mormon, and a horse has to be a horse and a goat has to be a goat, I'm in real trouble.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, these things have invalidated everything else, which is why you really have to have a solid idea of what translation was. Before I did the translation book, I had done a commentary in the Book of Mormon. And the commentary included history as I went through. So it was looking at the text of the Book of Mormon, and I laid it against history. And the book we're looking at, Traditions of the Fathers, is taking a lot of that information and putting it together in one place. And so, it's not spread out over 6 volumes of commentary and something else. But I get through with that and I'm looking and I said, I made some assumptions about how the translation worked. And unless I have a good solid explanation for how the translation was done, I really can't even talk about historicity, because then I'm bouncing back and forth and I'm changing my ideas about translation in order to fit my ideas of history. And it doesn't work that way.
Right.
So I said, I've got to come up with, and I have to have a good explanation for how the Book of Mormon was translated in order to be able to talk about history. And so the 2 books, the one you looked at before, Traditions of the Fathers, and this one, Gift and Power, I always considered them volume 1 and 2. These are 2 companions.
Yes.
It's sort of like, how do I know it's history, and, how do I know the history is translated right? And you kind of have to have both of them to be able to say, this is how it all fits together.
Yeah, I actually enjoyed reading it in that order, because you pretty much started this book with the assumption that it's the Book of Mormon is historical, and your previous book outlined the reasons why you see it converging with history. And what I would say as well is, because a lot of people who don't believe the Book of Mormon's authentic ancient record or historical, and they would point to a lot of these criticisms. But I think you're also making the argument that they should have to, how do you account for the convergences? For example, we talked about in the last episode, how do you account for the things in old world geography? How do you account for the things which seem complex beyond Joseph Smith's ability, or get into the witnesses of the gold plates, and it's not just focusing on the problems against, but if you're going to include all the data, then how do you account for the positive evidence? And for the most part, I've not seen too many critics, in my view, who have really dealt with a lot of those strong convergences or evidences. They're either maybe dismissed or not fully confronted, in my view. And I see faithful scholars like yourself who are trying to deal with the main criticisms against, not just focusing on the evidence for, which I think is important to address all of it. Okay, so let's move from anachronisms. Let's talk about the King James Bible in the Book of Mormon, and that's referred to as, you know, being like a 19th century element. So talk about your view of why King James Bible passages are in the Book of Mormon under, you know, a functional equivalent view of the translation. Also comment on New Testament passages, and your thoughts about, you know, how Joseph interacted with the italics, you know, deleting or changing the italics. Was he referring to a King James Bible? Because critics would say the evidence points to there had to have been a King James Bible open, even though none of the witnesses talk about one. They would say, well, the evidence is clear, and then talk about your thoughts of, could he have known the King James Bible well enough to have memorized it? How was he seeing the King James Bible passages? What are they doing in the translation?
You realize that's a long enough question that I'm not sure I'm going to get to all of it because I'm going to forget part of it.
Sorry, I'll prompt you. So talk about first of all, why are King James Bible passages in there?
We'll go back. Let's start with the idea of a functional translation and King James language. I think that's just because he's trying to imitate King James language. So it's not surprising. It was common. It was expected of a book of that at that point in time. That's how you knew that it was serious, is that it was in that language. So that part of it is hardly surprising at all. What is more surprising is we get quotations from the New Testament. And even times when you know that the New Testament passage is quoting an Old Testament passage, the quotation we get is probably closer to the New Testament. And I think that simply indicates that Joseph was much more familiar with the New Testament than he was the Old Testament, which, again, is not surprising for most Christians.
Right, because the critics' argument would be that's textually anachronistic. That wouldn't have been on, you know, on the gold plates. You know, right. If it comes from the New Testament, they wouldn't have had access to the words of, you know, Jesus speaking to his apostles in the Old World, or like the writings of Paul, for example.
Yeah, and it's quite true that he wouldn't have that. But the question is, where does this language come from? And if you are looking at Joseph Smith providing the language, if that meaning is there, then he comes up with, oh yeah, that meaning is expressed in this way in the New Testament. And so he uses that language. And if you look at the places where that language occurs, it occurs when you really look at them, they don't necessarily come as quotations. They come as allusions too, but with sort of long quotations, because it was a well-known scripture. And a lot more of this analysis is going to be in the book that I told you that's coming forth. There's a new analysis of it and a lot more information. But basically the idea is Joseph Smith is producing the text, and because these meanings trigger what he thinks, you know, that's how it gets there. And I don't know if I use the example or not, but it's the one that I always think of. I'm in a Greek class at BYU, and the teacher gives us this passage in Greek. And he says, I'd like you to translate this. So all the students get out, we get our dictionaries out, because of course we don't, you know, this is early in our Greek and we don't know these words. So we're looking them up and we're putting them together. And pretty soon we all realize that this is a New Testament quotation he's given us. And so almost everybody, except this one girl who was, you know, top of the class and, you know, the curve buster, the one who was, you know, better than the rest of us, she got it right. But the rest of us, as soon as we recognized that it was a New Testament passage to a person, minus that girl, we translated it exactly the way it occurred in the King James Version. We didn't vary. It wasn't different because we knew that language. And as soon as we thought that was the meaning, boom, the language came. Turns out it was not quite right. Turns out that the meaning was wrong. Turns out that there was better ways to translate it. But it never occurred to us because as soon as we caught the meaning, we translated according to what we expected it to be. And I think that's a real good explanation for what happens with Joseph. He sees the meaning and boom, translates it the way he expects it to be. He expects it to be language from the New Testament, and that's how it shows up. So I don't think it's that those quotations themselves were on the plates. I think we get those as explanations of how Joseph translated and the effect of his mind and his understanding of language, and particularly religious language. And that informs the translation. So I think it's evidence of the way the translation was done, but not the way what was on the plates.
Right. Aye. So Moroni, for example, didn't write word for word the same words as Paul, but it could have been similar words or similar revelation, inspiration recorded. But you're saying Joseph Smith is the translator.
Yeah.
As the meaning of it is coming to his mind through inspiration. He's clothing it in King James Bible, phraseology, language, including New Testament passages.
All right. Did I cover your question? Are we missing something?
So a critic might say, they might push back and say, is that distinguishable from what if Joseph Smith just knew the Bible really well and he could have just memorized, he's plagiarizing, memorizing and then dictating these long passages. Why don't you think that could, forgetting about all the historical convergences, why don't you think that could account for the King James Bible passages?
Yeah. Again, this is evidence that's coming from this newest book, because I just looked at that again and looked at it in the light of what Nick Fredericks has done in looking at those passages. So a lot of work has been done since I wrote that translation book. But when we look at it, again, they're not quotations. They are reworking sometimes. The language is there and it's similar, but it's contextually different. It's adapted. So, this isn't somebody who's pulling things out. And particularly if you look at which ones they are, I mean, they're pulling from all over the place. And if somebody's got a Bible open trying to flip through this thing, that's all they're doing all day is flipping through the Bible trying to find something, because it goes back and forth. So these are all phrases that are somehow triggered in his memory. It's language that he's heard before. And so that's what gets triggered. So I think that's where these things are coming from.
What about if someone argued that maybe he had them memorized? He was quite fluent in the Bible, like a revivalist.
No, he didn't have to memorize them. These are, there are always, have you been in and we've all been in this situation, we're talking with a bunch of people and we will make a movie reference or something. Somebody will say I don't think that word means what you think it means. And everybody knows that I'm talking about The Princess Bride, right? Mm-hmm. There are certain quotations that people can make from movies where we all know what they are.
Yeah.
And they're just embedded in our brain and we pull them out because they're references. And it's not because we've got something there that we're trying to quote from. This is part of our language, part of our understanding, part of our way of communication. And that's, I think, what it was for Joseph. Now, okay. I remembered another part of your question that we need to address, which is
dealing with, yes, and like the long Isaiah chapters, and the Sermon at the Temple is very similar to the Sermon on the Mount. And I think you mentioned in your book, it would stretch sort of credulity that he would have those memorized. So to a critic, they would say he had to have had a Bible open. You don't believe a Bible was consulted. What's your view of that?
Well, here's the problem that we have. The evidence of italics is fascinating because we know that Joseph Smith paid attention to italics. In a lot of cases, he deleted them and then had to make up words to make it fit again. Things are happening around italics. And, it's, even if I were memorizing Isaiah, I would not memorize an italicized word. That tells me this has to be visual. You have to look at it. So when the critics say they have to have a Bible there, they are correct in that I have to be seeing that Bible. We have a problem, which is all of the indications are that there's no Bible there. Nobody ever mentions a Bible. People specifically mention that there wasn't one. So we have a problem. Joseph saw, and we think he had to see a Bible because of what he saw, but the evidence is he had no Bible. So how do we explain that? Well, again, you go back to God and say, if God is allowing him to see things, God presents the right pages and he's looking at it. And he's reading off Isaiah because it's really close. You're not getting that close to Isaiah without, reading Isaiah.
Hmm.
But his head's in a hat. And so, yeah, somehow it has to be visual, absolutely. But the evidence is there was no book. Therefore, you have to invoke the divine and say it's the divine who is giving that picture to Joseph in his brain. But
Right.
yeah, he was paying attention to italics and he had to see them. But that's what he said he did, was to see them. So
And
we
just to
just
put
have
a
that problem.
and just put a fine point on how familiar Joseph would have been with the Bible, because I know his mom says, and this is might have been around the time when the angel first visited him, but he maybe had only read the Bible through once, or if he had even read through it once. And my question is, would he have had the ability naturalistically to have memorized and be able to recite all of these King James Bible passages? Or are you saying that maybe the meaning of the translation triggered it? Because a critic might wonder, could he have just done it himself? If you understand what I'm asking.
Yeah, and the answer is probably a combination of the above. There's a lot of those phrases that even if he didn't memorize them, he would have heard them in sermons. This is language of the day. These are
Yes.
again things that pop up frequently. Um,
And I've noticed that as I've reread the book more, there's small King James Bible phrases where I've went and I've checked them, but there may be a few words, so it's not always like a bunch of
yeah,
verses that are identical, but little phrases here and
yeah,
there.
and I think it's all explained by how the translation occurred. And I think once we understand that Joseph Smith's mind was present and we move away from that inerrantist, it has to be exactly this way. Once we know Joseph was part of the process, having Joseph's mind, Joseph's vocabulary show up instead of a Nephite vocabulary is hardly surprising. It would not surprise me at all if a Nephite vocabulary showed up where we'd look at it and we go, I have no clue what that's talking about.
Right.
Um, you get some of the idioms that are translated. We don't know what the Nephite idiom would have been, but it may have been something that we couldn't understand because we don't have the cultural reference to understand it, just like kicking the bucket. If you don't have the cultural meaning behind that, you can't translate it accurately, word for word. So I think once we get to the point where we say, yeah, Joseph Smith's mind was present in the process, it says that it's not, it says that this is a functional translation. Joseph Smith was there. Joseph Smith's mind was present and active and interactive with what was happening. So Joseph Smith is there in the translation. Sure, not a problem. What it does is it says the inerrantist model is incorrect, whether you use it apologetically or use it as a critic. That concept is incorrect, and we have to get rid of it on both sides of the argument. We have to go to something that's more realistic. It's very much like when they talk about DNA in the Book of Mormon. DNA in the Book of Mormon really doesn't do anything at all to the Book of Mormon, with one exception. It absolutely tells us that concept that we used to have, that all Native Americans came from Book of Mormon peoples, is wrong. That it absolutely does.
Yeah, they're
It
the only
just
people
blows
here
that
in
out of
kind
the
of
water.
spark geography.
Yeah, but that's not what the Book of Mormon said. So it doesn't really affect the Book of Mormon. What it affects is the way we had thought about the Book of Mormon. And I think a lot of these things that people are talking about, Joseph had to do this and memorize that. That doesn't say anything about the Book of Mormon. It says you have the wrong idea about how translation worked. You think
Right.
that's a criticism because you don't understand how translation worked, or at least you're not willing to understand it that way. But I think if we really have a good, sophisticated, solid, defensible understanding of translation, where you go back and what I said is you have a hypothesis and then you can explain the outliers. If you have a good hypothesis that explains the most and you can cover the outliers, then you've got a good theory and a good hypothesis. And I think we've got one for translation.
I
But
think
focusing on
would
the
you say,
outliers is the way to do it.
and similarly, you would point to maybe 19th century sounding like revivalist language, things like,
Oh
Sing
yeah,
Song of Redeeming Love, or The Pains of a Damned Soul.
Yep.
You had pointed that again as Joseph Smith as the translator clothing the translation.
Yep. That's his language. He knows how to speak it, and that comes in. And the only way that it's a criticism is if you assume a word for word translation.
Right.
Once you say it's not a word for word translation, now we're talking about translation, and those aren't issues at all.
Right. And I think in the book as well, you point out a 19th century phrase or idiom, which is probably like a metaphor. For example, I think it was Alma and Amulek. They flee as like a goat and their young flee from two lions. You talk about how like that couldn't be a literalistic translation. And that's probably evidence of Joseph Smith using his vocabulary for that metaphor to describe perhaps what the meaning was.
Yeah. And it's just like any of the agricultural metaphors are all based on Western European agriculture, wheat harvesting. All of those metaphors come from that world that Joseph understood. Wasn't anywhere in the New World.
Right.
There's one that talks about, it uses chaff as a metaphor. Well, you can use chaff as a metaphor because we have a cultural background. Even though I've never been a farmer, I know enough about wheat farming that I know what chaff is, and I know it blows in the wind, and I know what the metaphor means. But if you've never been around wheat agriculture, and no one in the New World had a large wheat agriculture, that idiom doesn't work. So where does the idiom come from? If you have an inerrantist idea of the Book of Mormon, a literal word for word, that's a problem. If you are saying this is Joseph Smith participating in it and creating a functional translation, yeah, it's totally logical because it's translating an idiom into an idiom that we understand.
Right.
So it's a question of translation. And again, I have seen people say that you wobble around on translation, and they actually said that my arguments that when I want it to be literal, it's literal. When I don't want it to be, it's functional, and that's not at all the way I approach it.
I actually want to bring this up next because
a
lot of and you talk about this in your book, a lot of scholars would use Hebraisms to support the Book of Mormon and probably support it more under a tight literal word for word translation. And I in the past would have interpreted Hebraisms as supporting come from like the ancient text and this making its way into the translation. Give us your view of Hebraisms, and do you think this supports the Book of Mormon or not under a functional translation?
Yeah, I don't. I think any Hebrewisms that you find there are the result of imitating the King James Bible that imitated the Hebrew. So there are Hebrew constructions that show up in the King James Bible because those translators tried very hard to keep it close to the Hebrew. So I think anything that shows up in the Book of Mormon shows up because of the King James language. I don't think there are any unique ones. I think that a couple of the ones that have been proposed, you can show that they are not correct. And again, it requires this literal word for word in order to get it right. And you can show that that doesn't happen. Even in cases where you find something, you say, here's this construction and it looks very Hebrew. Then you can find other places
conditional
where that construction's not there. So it's not consistent. And if it were a word for word literal, tight translation, it would happen all of the time, and it doesn't. So I am not a fan of the idea that there are Hebrewisms in the Book of Mormon. I don't think that it's been used as an evidence. I don't think it should be.
What if under your functional translation, what if they maybe sometimes make it through and sometimes don't because Joseph's the translator? What would you say to that?
I would say that you have to have a reason why they would make it through, and that's why I argue for names. I think if there's anything Hebrew, it's in the names. And I think the names are in Hebrew because otherwise we wouldn't find them, and we're supposed to find them so that we see the meanings. But that's where I would limit it. I would say, yeah, if there's a Hebrewism, it's in the name, and there is a reason why it's there. All of the rest of these are just, they're phrases that show up, and there's no reason for them to be any different than any other phrase there. So yeah, I can't give you a reason why that would show.
Right.
So the only ones I would accept are the names.
And the language that the Book of Mormon authors wrote on the gold plates, would there have been Hebrew in there? Because it's called Reformed Egyptian. Could there have been Hebrew
It's
that could
called
have made its way
Reformed
onto the plates?
Egyptian, and they specifically say we would have written in Hebrew if we could. So what that says is they didn't. So you have them saying, well, yeah, this isn't Hebrew, folks. Um, so yeah, maybe they could have, and obviously they had enough that we could get the names, but it's highly unlikely that the rest of the text was in Hebrew. Um, it was not correctly expressed in Hebrew. Whatever they were using was more concise. Um, but yeah, Reformed Egyptian and not Reformed Hebrew.
Right. And your thoughts on chiasmus in the Book of Mormon?
Chiasmus is there, and chiasmus is there because it's structural poetry. It's not language. What I would say is we have to be very careful when we make any arguments that are based on words. So when you say this word means something and you try to build an argument on it, you have to be very careful because that word is a translation. However, structures, those things survive translation. And so Hebrew poetry, or the elements of poetry of parallelism or chiasm, which is an inverted kind of parallelism, those kinds of things, because it's structural, those things can come through in the translation. Um, Whereas, specific words may or may not.
Okay. And your thoughts on, I think we talked about this when I interviewed about 6 months ago, but so under functionalist translation, you would say that a lot of it's just vernacular phraseology, terminology. What about specific names, Curelums, Cumems? I have Shum,
Yeah.
which wouldn't be in
Yeah, I
Joseph's
think those are
vernacular.
interesting because we don't get those in anything that Mormon did. We only get those in Nephi, or excuse me, we only get those in Moroni's translation of the Book of Ether.
Right.
So we have a very different source. We have a source that comes from a very different time. And what we have is Moroni, who is most likely using a translation that Mosiah II did. What I think happens on those in the explanation is that those were words that were on the Jaredite plates that Mosiah looked at and says, I don't know that animal. And rather than guess, he just transliterated. And when Moroni saw it, he said, I don't know that animal. And so he just transliterated. So I think the source and the antiquity of that source and separation of culture may have led to the fact that we have those specific names in the Book of Ether, but we don't get that kind of problem anywhere else. I think it's an odd case of translation where we have a transliteration because they didn't know what they were looking at.
Okay.
And of course, these are Mesoamerican people who would have known the Mesoamerican animals. So it's not a lone shifting issue. It's one where they say, that one I don't know, so I'll just transliterate it.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to say about the functional translation that we maybe didn't discuss that's
I think
relevant?
we've got it covered.
Got it covered pretty well. So last couple of questions and wrapping up because I have to go soon, but I want to keep talking to you all day. Um, what would be the main difference between you and, for example, Blake Ostler's expansionist theory? What would be sort of like your differences or critique without being critical of the difference between you functionalist view of the translation versus his maybe more conceptual, but maybe some parts of his are more tight as well?
Yeah. The easiest way to explain that is with the story of all of the blind men who are looking at the elephant, and they all describe the elephant differently based on where they're standing and what they're looking at. There's an elephant there, but they're only describing a piece of the elephant. And I think the biggest difference between what Blake has done and what I'm doing is that I'm trying to describe the whole element, and he's describing a specific part of the elephant. So there are places where I'm very, very much doing what Blake does. I think that has a place in translation. I don't think it describes all of translation. I think we need other pieces to know how it fits together and to know when we are allowed to say that this is conceptual. So I think it's the context more than the concept. I'm not sure that there may be specific places where he and I would differ on specific ones, but on the concept of what it is, I think we're quite aligned. And since he came up with the idea first, it's his, and I borrowed it.
His sort of like triggered an influence. I think he was almost quite revolutionary in that way, you know, because it was in the
Oh yeah,
1980s, wasn't it, when he wrote the article?
sure,
And I was
yeah,
really impressed with he addressed a lot of the 19th century elements or
yeah.
anachronistic things and had a theory that tried to
Yeah, and I
incorporate
think we
those.
just do it in different ways. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, I think his expansion would cover things that I would cover in other ways.
yeah,
But there's certainly concepts where there's a great amount of overlap, and a lot of my thinking of the places where there are conceptual translations is due to what Blake did. I mean, I'd read his paper, so obviously I was influenced by it.
yeah. And it seems a lot of people seem to admire and respect, you know, his view of the translation and trying to, you know, be thorough and make sense of all those different elements. So one final question, and this is coming more from, you know, a critic or an ex-member who doesn't believe in the Book of Mormon's historicity. So they might say, you know, forget about all the convergences you talk about in your book, forget about the last episode, forget about chiasmus or the complexity or the witnesses. Why doesn't, you know, King James Bible passages, errors, anachronisms, you know, the revivalist language, you know, Protestant sermons, you know, similarities between Lehi's dream and his own father's dream, you know, maybe the view of the Hebrews and like the mound builder myth about the Native Americans coming from the lost 10 tribes and that being similar to, you know, the Nephites and the Lamanites coming from Israel, and Joseph's own sort of creative genius in his vocabulary. Why doesn't that just explain the Book of Mormon with, you know, his creative genius? Like, why not go with that naturalistic explanation? And you're just making excuses with your conceptual translation to account for all the
Yeah,
problems.
that goes back to to what we were talking about on these translation anachronisms. If you're looking at parallels and you're saying I'm just looking at this set of things, yeah, you can come up with a naturalistic explanation of the Book of Mormon that says, yeah, why couldn't he do this? Why couldn't he be a creative genius? Well, he could have. And if he were, the longer that text was extant, the longer we dealt with it, the more we tried to find history in it, the worse it would get. Worse it would get. So if we assume that, if we said, okay, let's take that hypothesis, if that hypothesis is correct, then no history in here should match real world at all. It's mythical and it should never work. But it does. And there's so much evidence that says that it does. And we've got everything that we had talked about before, where there's some really good convergences that start to talk about those things. If Joseph were a creative genius, he could not have done those. So it's a question of what are you going to look at? And let's go back to the elephant. If I only look at the tail, I could probably come up with multiple reasons why the tail looks like a tail. And they could adequately describe the tail, no matter what you said about it. But you got to put it on the rest of the elephant. And if you ignore the elephant and only talk about the tail, yeah, you can say that's what it is. You got to look at the whole picture. And for people saying that there is a naturalistic explanation for the Book of Mormon, sure, there is, as long as you ignore a whole bunch of information.
Right.
So, if you begin with the fact that I'm going to say, my belief is the Book of Mormon is a modern fiction. I don't believe it's true. And then I give you a naturalistic explanation. You remember my comment from Stelle de Coulange that if you start looking for something, you'll find what you were looking for. If you start with that assumption, you will find evidence that will support that because you don't look at the contrary evidence. And the contrary evidence is, boy, there's a whole bunch of stuff that supports the historicity of the Book of Mormon. And that's, all of what we've talked about before.
Yeah.
So yeah, they could come up with it. Sure, it's possible, only if you ignore the rest of the elephant.
And then it's not even just things which converge with history, but as I've been doing more research on it, the sheer complexity of the Book of Mormon, how complex it would be, difficult for Joseph to orally dictate this without notes, manuscript,
Oh
keeping all
yeah,
these things in his head. accounting for the witnesses of the gold plates. And William Davis talked about in his book how it's like one of America's greatest oral dictations or performances they have in history, and replicating, dictating 588 pages, how many hours a day on average they would have spent. That's just something that the normal person couldn't do. I think 1 in 10,000, 1 in a million probably couldn't do. And I think that also adds to the difficulty of orally dictating this long, very coherent, complex narrative, all the genealogies, the internally consistent geography, and the things which seem to converge with, Mesoamerican geography, culture, things in the old world. You're right that like it should be looking worse over time, and you need to take into account those positive evidences along with some of those criticisms.
Yeah, and like I say, you've got to look at this whole picture, and the whole picture is really massive. And if you say, yeah, I'm looking at this iceberg and I'm going to describe the part that's, on top of the ocean that I can see, and assume that that's all there is, you've missed it. And that's what the Book of Mormon is like. Yes, you can come up with an explanation for the part that you see without looking underneath the ocean for the rest of the iceberg. But once you see the whole iceberg, yeah, it's pretty big, and you got to account for the whole thing.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, Brant, this has been, I think, a great interview and discussion. I've absolutely loved the time we able to spend with you yesterday and today. To talk about, your view of the translation of the Book of Mormon, answering a lot of questions people might have. And yesterday, talking about the convergences between, Mesoamerican geography, history, and the text of the Book of Mormon. I'll promote your book one last time, Translating the Book of Mormon, The Gift and Power. I'll put a link where you can get it. And also check out his other book, The Book of Mormon as History, as well. And if you enjoyed these episodes, please give it a thumbs up. Like this video, share it with people who you think might benefit from this, who might be helped by it, and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any future content. I'm hoping to bring Brant back in the future as well to discuss other things. And
it'd be fun.
With an upcoming book as well, we'll have to talk about that. So please subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you on the next episode. Take care, everyone. Thanks, Brant.
So long.
Thanks, everyone, for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.